Before we begin our program, the staff and I would like to make this acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor the land upon which we gather today as the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania still continues. We take this moment to recognize the original stewards of this land and the histories of violence and erasure that have brought us here today. Okay, so as you may know, in addition to our primary work as arts grantmakers, the center also functions as a hub for dialogue around issues that are critical to cultural practice. This work represents a capacity building effort on our parts that is meant to connect our community and colleagues to their peers nationally and internationally. And we hope this work also makes a contribution to the fields we serve that goes beyond our grant dollars, although we know the grant dollars are important. To that end, we produce publications with original scholarship. We present lectures, symposia, webinars. We organize other kinds of convenings and connectings that explore relevant topics of the moment. As part of this work too, we also have a visiting artist and scholar program for which we invite a distinguished practitioner to be in residence with us for a protracted period and to focus through a variety of activities that they design on an issue of particular urgency and timeliness. In 2021, the focus of this program is on Black cultural production. And we could not have found a better partner and colleague with whom to pursue this work than our visiting scholar and today's moderator, Linda Earle. Linda has worked in the arts as an educator, administrator, funder, and curator, and as an advocate for inclusion, freedom of expression, and development of new platforms for cultural practice, participation, and discourse. She is currently the Professor of Practice in Fine Arts Management and the Associate Graduate Director for the Arts Management MA at Temple University. Before joining Temple, Linda served as Executive Director of the Great Lakes Colleges Association's New York Arts Program, an academic and professional development semester for undergraduates. She was director of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture from 1999 to 2009, and a senior program director at the New York Arts Council, New York State Council on the Arts, where the individual artist program was founded under her leadership. Linda has taught film and cultural studies at Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers, at Hunter College, and at Barnard College, and has served on numerous grants and commissioning panels and artist advocacy groups. She has served on the College Art Association's Awards Committee for Distinction in Diversity and on the boards of arts and services organizations. As a writer, Linda has held residencies at Hedgebrook and the Writers' Room, and has collaborated in many creative and curatorial projects over the years. We're very lucky to have her as our visiting scholar for 2021. And so I am happy to turn today's activities over to Linda. And without further ado, I will do that. So Linda, take it away.
Thank you, Paula. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been a wonderful time to reflect and connect and learn for me. And you and the whole Pew staff have been incredibly hospitable and collegial. And my special thanks to Melissa and Kelly for their support and conversation during this time, the residency so far. I also want to acknowledge the writers and curators and archivists I've been talking to, reading and learning from over the past several weeks. And you'll meet some of them in subsequent conversations in this little series when we talk about the digital dimension of archives and curatorial practice. But all of them, everyone I've talked to is really present because of their contributions and their good counsel during this residency, and I thank them. Just to focus on archives for a number of reasons. As I've written, because it is a way, a sort of rhizomatic way across the expanse of the vast expanse of Black cultural production. because it's also a way of navigating the complexities and dynamic of power and resistance that shape Black life and Black cultural production. And because my life and my work have just been enriched so much by the art, scholarship, and thinking made possible by people doing this essential cultural work of collecting, surfacing, and contextualizing Black cultural narratives. And so I'm so excited to have two of those people here today, our wonderful speakers, Rayna Andrews and Simone Fujita. Rayna is archivist for the Henry Luce Foundation African American Collecting Initiative at the Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian Institution. Rayna has also worked in special collections at Bryn Mawr and the Kislex Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at Penn. Simone Fujita is a bibliographer, is the bibliographer for African American Art History Initiative at the Getty Research Institute. She's also been the zine project manager at LIA Microaggressions Projects and a library and outreach coordinator at the Art Center of the College of Art Design. And Simone has also chaired the Southern California chapter of the Art Library Society of North America. There's a lot more to say about both of them. We have had wonderful conversations so far, which we're hoping to share with you today. And that will happen very shortly. Providing access, demystifying the archive, inviting new scholarship and exploration, creative research. These are all things that all of the archivists and librarians I've spoken to have stressed as primary force and primary motivation for them. So in addition to talking about the mission and impact of their work, I'm going to ask Rayna and Simone to talk about the substance of their day-to-day and how they've developed ways of working as a result of their interrogation of the assumptions that really construct institutional authority in an archive. And this is important because despite the aura of authority around archives, we're here today to talk about them because they're not neutral spaces and procedures are never neutral. And it's sort of like the architecture of memory can reflect subjectivity. Like memory, conscious and unconscious material and the history that informs that subjective position tends to become embedded in and expressed through institutional structures and habits and practices. The renewed energy around raising what has been submerged, devalued, or ignored in general archives and building the capacity and the reach of archives collected by Black folks is not really merely remedial. It's really forward-thinking and imaginative. It's as much about possibility as history. And so we'll be talking about that today. And I thank them again for being here and partners in conversation. So I'd like to just start by asking Rayna and Simone to talk about their roles in their respective institutions, what it means in terms of day-to-day labor, what they do, and because they're already in dialogue, to talk to each other and take off from there. I'll keep track of our time. I'm going to be moderating very lightly because they are the ones with the expertise, and I won't butt in very much, but I'll also be watching the clock and making sure that we have enough time for your questions and some conversation. Rayna, could you begin to talk about what you're doing at the Archives of American Art?
Sure. So as Linda said, I am the archivist for the Henry Luce Foundation African American Collecting Initiative at the Archives of American Art. So what I do now and what my traditional before times job description was are kind of two different things. I was hired to be a processing archivist. And so my actual job requires me to be in the office, which many of us aren't at the moment. So before everything happened, when I'm in the office, I am most of my time is spent processing collections. And when I say processing, that can mean a lot of different things, but essentially collections come in to the Archives of American Art in many different forms. Sometimes things are in really great condition, and I'm really just taking materials out of one folder and putting them in another. And in some cases, I am really doing a lot more work, but we're refoldering and arranging and describing collections. And I should back up a little bit. And when I say collections, we're talking about personal papers of artists, or gallery or organizational files. So it can include correspondence or financial documents or photographs or exhibition records, photographic material, born digital material, audiovisual material. It sort of runs the gamut. We've got a lot of different things coming in, but we don't generally have artwork unless it's something like a sketchbook or small sketches, but like we're not collecting large paintings or sculptures or things that would show up in a museum. All this to say, we're getting all of this material in, and my job is to sort of impose an order upon it if there isn't a discernible order that comes with it from the creator. So arranging that material and then describing it in a finding aid, which is really the access part of it. The goal with archives and libraries and GLAM institutions in general is really access and making sure that our users can see what we have and find it and really use it. So the finding aid is, the box and folder list, but it's also making it available for digitization on demand. So somebody can look at it online and say, oh, that exhibition file is something that I would like to see, and they can pay to have that file digitized, which is something that has been really great in the pandemic, because that is still, now that some people are back in the office, that is a service that has continued. It's continued to the extent that it is actually backed up. So there's a little bit of a longer lead time on it. But it's really great because we've been able to provide more access to our researchers in that way. All this to say, that processing work is the core of my work as an archivist usually, and hasn't been in this time. So since I've been working from home, I've really pivoted my focus to working on the metadata. The metadata for a lot of our collections related to African American art and artists has been a little bit sparse and all over the place and not consistent, which is another big barrier to accessing our collections. So if somebody were to search for African American artists or African American painters or anything like that, the results that they would find that would come up under one of those searches before wasn't necessarily all inclusive. Or they might search for African American artists, but a collection might only be tagged with African American painters, and therefore that collection wouldn't show up, or vice versa. And so I was doing a project to really survey what tags, or not tags, what subject terms were applied to what collections, what was missing, what data was being lost, and then did a huge sort of redescription project. And this was something that had been sort of on my back burner for a while. I would dip in and out of it with help from interns, but I now had the time to work on it. And so that was a project that I undertook to really revamp that description a lot.
Could I ask you just to talk a little bit about what the mission of the African American Collecting Initiative is?
Sure, yes. So the African American Collecting Initiative is started off as a 3-year initiative beginning in 2017. So the years have gotten a little bit fuzzy again because of everything happening. And it's funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, and it funded a collector to go out and collect. And then it also funded half of my time processing. So the goal was really to bring more collections into the archive, to really boost up and bolster our collecting in that area. It's not that we didn't have any African American collections, but we were severely lacking in that area. And so it was really to bring more in. And it was also because we found that like once you have more and you show that you really are collecting in that area, that's a way to then bring more in. It's a self-perpetuating cycle. So it was really focused on the collecting, but we've learned from other initiatives that if you focus all of your attention and all of your energy on collecting and then don't focus any attention on the processing, then that doesn't really work because you've brought everything in, but you haven't made it accessible. So they've learned from that, and they, with this initiative, focused on the collecting, but then also brought my position in to process those collections that were being brought in so that we could say, look, we're bringing in these collections and also you can access them. Here's the finding aid for it now. Mm-hmm. So really just from start to finish, everything is going. And obviously, the collector was bringing in way more collections than I can process. I can only process so quickly, but showing that like this collection came in during the initiative and has been processed during the initiative, and that this work is ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Simone, tell us what you're up to.
Okay.
Getty.
Yes, so I am the bibliographer for the African American Art History Initiative at the Getty Research Institute. And the Getty Research Institute is slightly different from the museum. Everyone hears Getty and they think Getty Museum, but we actually have a number of different related and connected institutions at the Getty Center. And the Getty Research Institute is really about supporting scholarship and the creation of new art historical knowledge. So we have a research library, we have special collections in order to support creation of new, art histories and new knowledge and new interpretations about art history. So the initiative was announced when the Getty Research Institute acquired the Betty Starr archives, which we haven't physically gotten yet. I just want to say we haven't physically taken hold of them, but there's an agreement. So that was the first. That was the first big announcement to show that there's been a shift in the way that we're doing things, and this is a concerted effort with staff devoted to specifically, stewarding and bringing in collections related to Black artists. So it's kind of similar to what Rayna was saying. It's not that I would say it's not that we didn't have anything or any books on Black artists or anything related to Black art. It's that it could definitely use a lot more attention and development and a devoted focus on supporting bringing these materials in. So my colleague Lauren is the curator who brings in special collections, and I'm a librarian and archivist, but currently I'm working a little bit more as a librarian, and I'm doing collection development, which means that I'm acquiring library materials. So I'm the person selecting books, zines, magazines, online resources, some artist books and other special collections materials. And I'm also working on a digital bibliography project, which I'll probably talk about a little bit later because I think Rayna and I were going to talk about that. So, so although I'm technically more in a librarian position now, and I'm not going to be processing the collections that come in for the initiative, as Rayna is doing at Archives. I feel like my background in archives, having been an archivist, is really driving a lot of the work that I'm doing as bibliographer for the initiative, because I'm always trying to think about those issues that Rayna mentioned, like access. How are we going to provide access? We're bringing collections, but we have to make sure that we're not just building a huge backlog and kind of like bringing things in without allowing people to access them. So so that goes for archives, but also when I'm thinking about library collections and you know, how the library in concert with like the archival materials, how they're going to be used for research to create new scholarship on Black artists. You know, how can we broaden the reach so that it's not just scholars or just people with PhDs, but also, you know, how can we connect it with the communities in Los Angeles? How can we, you know, just kind of expand it so that artists and curators and other people can, like, people, I think that there's this misconception that, you know, archives are really only for scholars, but I think that there's so many exciting uses for archives that we could really employ and that could really inspire and provoke a lot of new thought and practice that I think that, you know, I think high schoolers could benefit from connecting with archives. I think there's just so many audiences that we could try to include and reach out to. So I guess that's it for now.
Okay. Well, you know, I want you to have a dialogue with each other about your work. I wanted to sort of ask about, you know, maybe specific things that have come up for you that where you, the existing practice wasn't sufficient to your mission. And Simone, in terms of what you're doing, you talk about sort of how interdisciplinary, how, for example, music permeates the visual arts in Black culture, and needing more latitude that way in collecting. So I'll let you start.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess one thing I failed to mention is that the Getty Research Institute historically collections were more Eurocentric in terms of the library collections, at least. I think that with our archives, there's a lot of different types of content, but with the library collection, I think historically it tended to be more Eurocentric. And if you looked at it as a bulk, like the types of materials we were collecting. So it's really exciting to be able to expand and enhance the collections and oh shoot, I feel like I'm losing my answer to what you're saying because I'm just excited about talking about library collections. Yeah. But yeah, so thinking about new things that we could include, like talking multidisciplinarily. I'm really interested in even looking into like sheet music, illustrated sheet music, album covers, those types of things that document the entirety of Black cultural production in different ways. So when I approach my work, I'm not just thinking about the typical categories that people think of with art, like sculpture, painting, drawing. I'm thinking about, you know, designers, fashion design, musicians, and costume design, and just like the whole graphic design, like the whole holistic view of Black cultural production, because I think that it's like an ecosystem that kind of feeds itself. Like there's so much cross-pollination in different disciplinaries of Black art in its many forms.
Yeah, it's kind of like what's going on art history, which has been broadened by a visual culture perspective. So I think there's similar changes going on in academia and thinking about how the art history is presented. So that's really interesting. Rayna, how about you in the question of changes in practices?
I think, so my changes in practices are, I think, very different. But first, I just want to say, like, I think it's really interesting because as Simone is talking about this and sort of the ties of like cultural production, especially in Black culture, how so many of the artists that our collector, Erin Gilbert, brought in for the Luce initiative were performance artists or were producing art in multiple forms. And that was a really specific and conscious choice on her part. She really wanted to bring in collections from artists who weren't, abstract painters or realist painters. And she did bring in collections from abstract painters, but was really looking at performance artists and artists who are creating in all of these other different forms, or working with less conventional materials and things like that, just because it's part of Black culture and it's part of Black material and Black artistic culture to work in these other ways. And so I think it's the way that all of this is tying in is just really interesting. But to go back to your question, I think that because of the way that I've been working, the way that I work within the records, I've sort of been pushing against the norms, but I still have to work within them. And that's been a little bit of the struggle. And I think something that Simone and I will probably be talking about as we talk about one of her projects, because working with the metadata project has been really interesting, because we at the archives, when we're talking about subject terms, we use primarily Library of Congress subject terms, and then some terms from the Getty Art and Architecture thesaurus. Don't know why it's so hard to say that one. So we're using authorized terms from a variety of sources, but sometimes there just isn't one that completely fits, or it's not right and we don't like it. But that's a separate issue. And so there's precedent, and we've sort of just decided that sometimes we will just have our own local term. There's precedent both within the Archives of American Art and also within the Smithsonian to do this. The National Museum of the American Indian has created an extensive vocabulary of their own, simply because Library of Congress is very not good when it comes to Native and Indigenous populations. It's just Library of Congress is very bad. Library of Congress subject headings. So for authorized terms, sometimes authorized terms are just not where you need it to be. And we've been working within that framework for so long that it's been hard to find that line. But it's also trying to find where to maybe depart entirely from authorized terms, or depart from even the idea of authorized terms and sort of go into colloquial terms and the terms that people are going to use when they're coming to research. Because going back to bringing more people in to the archives to research and to use our collections, historically, many of our users have been art historians and researchers and professors and what have you. But if we want to bring in more high schoolers, more people from the community, then we want to also make it accessible and make it easy for them to find things. And other people who don't wade into this all the time don't think in terms of authorized headings. They think in terms of the language that they use. And so we have to find that barrier, and that's the thing that we're still trying to figure out. So I've been playing with that and toying with that, and it's still not a thing that I figured out, but it's where I'm living right now.
Can I ask you a quick question, Rayna? Sorry, I don't want to, just a side, a little like follow-up question on this, and then back to you, Linda. Are you able to incorporate some of the work that Archives for Black Lives Philadelphia has done in your work? I just wanted to mention, for people out there in the audience that don't know, there's this great collective of archivists and memory workers called Archives for Black Lives Philadelphia, and they developed a resource for anti-racist description. So that's really fascinating. You can take a look on their website, and it's right there available for anyone, but it includes things like using less euphemistic language, like if you're talking about slavery or rape or things, just address it head on.
Or Japanese incarceration, yeah.
Yes, and then let's see what else. Like use less flowery language. Like try to stay away from.
Oh, that one has been so huge. In another project that I'm working on right now, the descriptions that I've had to change have been, well, some of them, they've been copied over from other things, and it's just like, we don't need to be calling people preeminent, and it's just not necessary.
Yeah, and it doesn't really tell you, it doesn't expand the research value by using those kinds of words. But our colleague Molly at the Brooklyn Museum included the link if anyone's interested. It's in the chat.
Oh yeah, perfect. Thank you, Molly. But yes, I looked at that document a ton, and was pulling from that as much as I can. And some things it's always working within an institution, and working within an institution that's within a larger institution.
Right.
There are certain things that you want to do that you can't do, and certain things that you want to do and your institution wants to do, but it's also just not feasible. And so like, there are many layers to things. I think there are also a lot of things that we all want to do, but it's not necessarily, but it's also just a question of how. So we're also just, sometimes the technology needs to catch up with, like the technology that we're using needs to catch up with the things that we want to do, which is a whole other situation. Sometimes like we're just not using the right technology to allow us to achieve our best description goals.
Yeah, I know. I just want to give a shout out to my colleagues at the Getty Research Institute who are in the anti-racist description working group at the Getty. I'm not closely involved with that at all, but I just want to give a shout out because that's something that we're working on. But as you hinted, it takes a lot of time and effort, and it's complicated. It's not as easy as just always deleting something and adding a new term.
I was gonna actually ask a related question about whether there are at the your respective archives, Simone, you just answered, DEI processes that include a conversation about how you do business, and that it might be tied to.
Sorry, if there are DEI
Are there anti-racist, is there a larger institutional conversation that flows into your work?
Again, the Smithsonian is so big
Yeah.
that there are definitely conversations happening. I think we are so far removed that like we are having our own conversations, and then they're having their conversations at much higher levels. And at some point we hope to meet in the middle. We're definitely, so my unit has a description working group or a metadata working group. And then there's a larger SI-wide description working group. And so they're focused on description, not necessarily on diversity and inclusion, but everybody in both of those working groups, like it's very tied to DEI work. It's very tied to how can we make this better description to be more inclusive, to be better. So I think even if it's not from a DEI, even if it's not from a directive, it's through that lens, if that makes sense.
And we just got a sort of relevant question about examples of terms that might be obsolete or offensive or just inappropriate or just don't work anymore.
This isn't specific to Black people, but some examples that I always think of off the top of my head are sexual minorities for LGBTQ.
Yeah, that's a real bad one.
And then also illegal aliens.
Yeah. Oh, speaking of the illegal aliens one, there's a question in the chat from Jenna about instruction that teaches a critical aspect. And there's actually a podcast that now I cannot remember. I think it might be This American Life, but don't quote me on that. That's actually all about a class that works to try and change the illegal aliens subject heading.
There's a great documentary, and we had an internal screening that my colleague Sarah Wade helped to coordinate. And Sarah, if you're hearing, you can drop the name of the documentary in the chat.
Yes,
I'm just
okay.
blinking out on the name, but it's
so
about
am I. I'm
exactly
like,
what you're talking about.
There have been
Change
a bunch
the subject. Yes.
Thank you.
Change the subject.
Because it talks about how it's so like so many people acknowledge that this is very bad, and yet it's so hard to do it. And then
politics got
this documentary, I think, might have even happened before the most recent round of how terrible everything is with that particular one. But yeah, a few other examples. One example is the term Hispanic. We at the Archives of American Art, the subject term is still Hispanic, and we decided to change that internally simply because we had a Latino collecting initiative, and so we have a number of artists who don't identify as Hispanic, and so we changed it internally to Latino and Latin American, simply because we felt that reflected our collections better. And that one is like a little bit trickier because there are many people who still do identify as Hispanic. So it's not that is necessarily offensive or wrong. It's just that it lacks nuance. So that's the thing, is that like some of the subject terms are wrong, bad, like this should be changed, and others are just, they don't quite meet our needs, and that's where things get a little bit dicier, and we're trying to figure it out as we go along.
I'm just going to mention some things from the chat, since I think only the panelists are seeing chat, and there's some really good comments here, and we'll copy them down and share them. But Lauren mentions as an example, slave versus enslaved person, focus on the humanity over status and label. Yeah,
that's another good one.
Great example. Yeah,
great. just one more question around this is how much agency do you have? I mean, you're part of a system, so in changing labels and changing descriptors, how much latitude do you have as an individual working?
I'll just say, well, gosh, I think all of us that work in libraries and archives feel kind of limited by the fact that we need to use Library of Congress subject headings. Like that's just professional practice across the field. And it's, so it's hard because that's really something that doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility, but we do find workarounds. Like for example, at the Getty, we found a way, or let's see, well, I'm trying not to get too technical. Basically, there's been a workaround that's been developed for like illegal aliens heading, to change it to undocumented when you're viewing the record. So like suppressing the view so that you don't have to see that offensive term. That's one way that we've been able to develop a workaround. And then in terms of my own work though, I think that I'm in the digital bibliography project that I'm doing, I kind of completely circumvented Library of Congress subject headings because I'm using unstructured tags to describe the contents of articles, which I'll show you what I'm talking about in a few minutes. But so that's been one way to kind of totally do a workaround and avoid them, and make them, so that they don't have to conform to these library and archive standards that normal people looking for access might not use those terms.
It's interesting. Of course, it comes to my mind, like, how do we approach the Library of Congress about changing these terms?
There's a whole like process, and it's very long and drawn out, and people do it.
Yes.
And
one of my library
successful.
Heroes is Sandy Berman, who is known for, he's a cataloger. He was a cataloger in Minnesota, and he is known for always writing about offensive terms. And he's been doing it for years and years and years before we started using terms like critical cataloging. So anyway, go ahead, Rayna, sorry.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so first of all, I'm very excited to hear you talk about tags, because I want to hear all about this project of yours, because I feel like you're going to help answer some of my questions about like how I can do this better. Because for us, like where we are right now, it requires a certain amount of institutional buy-in, especially, so part of it is the fact that like, at least where I am, like, I'm not the only one applying these terms. And so it doesn't mean anything if I'm the only one doing it. Like everyone has to use the term across the board when they're doing it. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. It's not, that's why I did the other project, because if the term isn't applied consistently, it's not particularly helpful. So if I only change it once, or if I only change it where I see it and nobody else is changing it when they see it, it's not necessarily helpful. So part of the goal of, the metadata working group within the unit is to get an idea of what kinds of things we want to change and what kind of terms we want to be using, so that we can have guidelines for everybody who will be applying terms, so that they know this is what we should be doing. This is where we should be, like, this is the kind of thing that we should be applying, so that these are the things that, those are the terms that do get applied. And then if there is a question, somebody can go back, because not everybody geeks out about metadata the way that Simone and I do. Not everybody is thinking about it this much, and they want to be able to like feel confident and empowered to apply the term that makes sense without like going down this weird rabbit hole. They want to be able to like maybe look at a list and be like, yes, that one. And I think that's good. Like, we should be able to have those lists and make people feel confident in the ones that they're choosing. But if we're not all following the same list, then it doesn't work. But the other thing is that we're not the only unit using the larger SI archive space. We're all, going into that same bucket, I guess. So everybody has to, I guess, follow the same rules, sort of. It's slightly different, but it's not. That's where my technological understanding of how it all works starts to break down, if I'm being honest, because we're not all connected, but we're kind of connected. And like, if you completely delete it from archive space, it will mess up another unit's records. But at the same time, if you click on it to see it, it won't show you other. Again, this is where my understanding of it breaks down. And I'm sure if one of my colleagues is watching us right now, I'm going to get an email later trying to explain it to me, and I'm going to be like, it's fine.
Well, we have a comment from Miriam who said there needs to be the technology that's the equivalent of find and replace all or something.
Yeah, agreed.
Yes. But the problem though is that sometimes it is applied where it needs to be, and sometimes it's not.
It's not. Yeah.
So find and replace
some.
all, but only when it's wrong. We need smart AI.
Yeah, smart AI. We have a lot of questions. People are excited to ask questions, but I know you want to talk about tags. So do you want to do that first and then circle back to some of these questions? And to our audience, we will get to all of your questions after this.
I just also wanted to mention in terms of like classification and categorization, there's also the issue of in libraries classification with like where something is in the library, and there's like Dewey Decimal classification, and Melville Dewey, who developed the system, has developed a very Eurocentric system. That's another whole thing to talk about. But we're lucky because there were pioneers in the field of librarianship, like Dorothy Porter, who was at Howard and developed the Moreland Spingard Research Center. And she was a Black librarian who was collecting a lot of Black materials and recognized that the system of Dewey was not going to work for Black materials, not accurately capturing like the depth and complexity of the types of materials. It only allowed for her to assign things to either the larger category of slavery or colonialism, not like artistic anything, because obviously there's a lot missing there. So anyway, I just want to say we have some interesting like pioneers in the field that were thinking about this way back in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, it's interesting how language structures knowledge, of course, but in ways that we just don't even realize sometimes. And that's what you're really talking about. So I didn't mean to interrupt, but.
No, yeah. I just wanted to throw her in because we don't often get to hear her story enough. So, okay, I'm gonna attempt to share screen. Okay, can you see this? Okay. So I consume a lot of art news every day as part of my work, as a way to drive my collection development work, just to also be well informed about what exhibitions are going on and things like that. But along with exhibitions, I'm always thinking about, okay, is there a catalog that goes with that exhibition that I need to keep an eye out for? Or, did this artist just publish a zine? I got to make sure I get that before it's sold out, things like that. So so I'm always consuming a lot of art news, and I thought, gosh, I need to keep track of this somewhere, and it would be great to be able to make it available to the public and to other researchers, because I'm just going through all of this, but there's got to be a way to capture this, because this is such an unprecedented time in terms of like news coverage and, you know, proliferation of exhibitions on Black artists and a lot more scholarship and just so many exciting developments in the field right now. So I used this site Zotero, which is actually a citation management site that many times students will use to keep track of their citations for papers, but we're kind of adapting it for use in creating sort of like a database where we were able to quickly, and whenever I say we, I'm really talking about me most of the time. And then I had a summer intern helping me last summer, Eric Olson, who was a huge help. But so we have over 900 articles here. I have another 300 plus to be added. And it's kind of showing all these articles in the news that are more recent, that are from the last few years. When you're doing research, typically databases will have, you know, cut off, and they don't usually have the most current material available when you're looking at journals and databases. So this is a way to kind of like capture the most recent news. So there's a lot here. And then in terms of metadata, I asked Eric, my summer intern last year, to add tags. So we have unstructured metadata for these articles. So if you see, if you click on Beatriz Milhas, the Brazilian artist, then you can see that there's this article. If you go into tags, it'll tell you, okay, she had an exhibition at Pace Gallery. And then me deselect. And Rayna, feel free to ask me anything if any questions come up. So this was from Dazed in March of last year about Antoine Sargent and Bernard Lumpkin, the collector. Let's see. So, and then we have here different names of people that are in the article, that are listed in the article. And a really thoughtful intervention that our intern Eric developed was, as they went on and looked at all the coverage, you know, they were thinking, I'm wondering about the ways that artists are described in articles, and if it's always accurate, or if it's using words that the artist would use to describe themselves. So Eric took the step to look at people's Instagram accounts and look at profiles online and see how the artist would describe themselves versus just the description imposed by whoever's writing an article, or, you know, whatever news site is reporting on the person.
And Simone, I love Zotero, because you can get a browser connector that does some of the work for you. You want to describe that?
Yes. Yeah. So we have, I think I might have removed it from my view today, but you can usually just click the icon in the corner if you're on a website, and then it'll save it to a Zotero. You can create like different libraries or different folders to sort of organize the content. This is like something I did for a presentation I did relating to Black cultural production and the occult. And Yeah, anyway.
So
That's-
Simone, for the different tags that
Mhm.
you apply to each thing, it's really whatever sort of whoever or whatever was mentioned in the various articles.
Mhm.
Okay.
So that's really, I just had told Eric, please just like, we want to make sure that whatever artists are mentioned are captured in the article. When you're indexing the article in Zotero, let's note if it's a newspaper article or a blog, blog piece or whatever, and then the author's name, the publication, just certain key details. Yeah, and institutions that are named, or like exhibition names or things like that. But you know, I think that I'm still going to have to go through and do some cleanup, because I was adding some tags, Eric was adding some tags. So again, we want to make sure that things are unified in our approach. Like there's things where it's like first name, last name, and then other ones are like last name, comma, first name for artists. So we want to make sure that everything's, uniform in the approach, just for the ease of access.
It occurs to me that the tags also sort of build a path forward for when there's another set of changes in language and approach, right? So it's just more.
It's a lot easier to adapt and change than going in and using library. The process for changing a Library of Congress subject heading. So anyway,
right.
Okay, I guess I will stop sharing.
Well, we have some, I'm looking at the time, it's just past 3 o'clock. The time has gone so fast and we have a lot of questions. So may I start dishing out the questions to you? From Brenda. Rayna, does the collection job involve efforts to maintain the original organizational format of the artists whose work you're processing? I'm remembering my study, NYU Performance Studies, many years ago with Genevieve Oswald at Lincoln Center Performing Arts Collection, and the aim to maintain the original categories.
Yes. So whenever possible, we maintain original order. Original order is always preferred. So, that is the context and that's the order and the arrangement in which an artist or an organization has kept their records, and that is really useful for researchers. That being said, if we get a collection in and there does not appear to be any order, then we will I will arrange it into some sort of series arrangement. So, sometimes we get collections and they're already very well organized. It's almost like they just took their filing cabinet and put it in a box, and it's really straightforward. But there are many, many collections in which I've got, their 1972 taxes next to their baby pictures, next to, their love letters, and their exhibition files are scattered all amongst them, and everything's just in a box. And in that case, that's really not helpful to a researcher. And so then I will put them in a series arrangement, correspondence with correspondence, photographs with photographs, exhibition records with exhibition records, just so that a researcher can come in and find what they are looking for. But yes, original order is preferable, and we will maintain it as much as possible whenever possible. So sometimes, their personal papers, like their personal correspondence and their photographs, are not arranged at all, but then their exhibition records are all in chronological order, and then cool, exhibition records are staying exactly how they are, or their exhibition records are like definitely in an order and I can't really figure out what that order is, but they're in an order. So maybe the exhibition records will stay in that order that I haven't quite figured out what it is, but it's an order. and the exhibition records will stay in whatever order that is.
Mhm.
But then I will put the other things in the order that makes the most sense to me and the researcher. So it depends.
Well, that's advice to artists too, and that's another conversation about artists preparing their work for archives, which
Oh, absolutely. My other advice to artists is to date things. Put dates on everything.
mhm.
There's nothing that's more frustrating for an archivist than looking at something, and especially like flyers, and being like, when did this happen? What year? Why? So put dates.
Okay, and we have another question from Brenda and for Simone and Rayna about talking about how to reach other audiences beyond secondary school, communities on the ground, and always the question of outreach beyond academia. And what ideas you have about that?
I guess I can start with that. So my background before working at the Getty was being outreach and an instruction librarian at Art Center College of Design. And I worked there for many years, and I loved engaging the students in the collections. It's like one of the highlights of my job, because so many students were not learning about artists of color and were hungry for that content. And that's how I was when I was an undergrad. So I really related to that. And my art history program was not diverse at all. So it's like that's what's driven my interest in archives and in doing collection development, is always trying to like expand or dismantle the canon.
Mhm.
So anyway, so I think it's really important to think about broad audiences. And when I was growing up, I never knew about the Getty Research Institute, even though I'm from Los Angeles. So I'm very cognizant of that, and I'm very eager to develop, maybe in this time, virtual programs about artists and their work, like books, like book talks or conversations between artists, and talking about their zines and publications and artist books, or people who are doing work about book design and like decolonization of the book industry. Like there's just so many different ways we could go with developing virtual programs that could engage a wide variety of people. And then that'd be a really great way for us to let people know that the Getty Research Institute is a free institution where people can go do research. You have to sign up to become a reader, but we're actually there for the public. So so it's not, just for academics. So that's one way I've been thinking about trying to do outreach and engagement going forward in the situation that we're in now. I know that my colleagues in the reference department at the Getty are also looking at doing like virtual visits to special collections, and developing ways, because they've purchased like equipment to help take photos and almost do like a virtual visit with classes and different things. So, but I'm really cognizant that like when we're building collections, it's no good to build a collection if nobody's going to use it. That's always the major thing. And I want people who are in LA and Black people in LA to know that we have this resource where they can do research on Black artists.
Rayna, did you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, very similar. I think a lot of the stuff that Simone said about like building virtual programs, I think is super important, especially now. We've seen that virtual programs help bring in so many more people and broaden your audience, and that's really important and vital. And one thing that I had been thinking about before, so part of the Henry Luce Foundation initiative was we have funding for an intern every summer. And I would review the applications for that internship. And every summer I would get so many applications from students who weren't necessarily right for the internship because the internship involved a lot of like archival processing and things like that, and an art history background. And these students were coming from art schools, and they were all great applicants in that they were all writing these strong cover letters about how they wanted to connect to their artistic history, the lineage. And they weren't really right for the internship, but that all got me thinking about how we could perhaps partner with art schools to get them to. I would obviously need to like flesh this idea out a lot more, but I think connecting with art schools to show like art history essentially, and to get them thinking about the artistic through lines and the artistic lineage, especially with Black artists and artists of color, but even just in general, I think is a huge idea, and it would be hugely beneficial and would also get younger people especially thinking about ways to use the archives, which is a great thing. And we want more people coming into the archives and seeing that again, we're free. You can come see us anytime, just make an appointment, because our reading room is small. And we have stuff on our website, and just bringing more people in, and maybe working with high school art classes too, just getting more people to know that we exist and that we have a lot of really cool stuff.
Mhm.
I think that's the key, just like making more people aware of who we are and what we do, and that we have cool things.
I love that idea of
Yeah.
working with art students, and especially because when I was at Art Center, I was always talking to one of my colleagues and saying like, I wish we could run a workshop on preservation and archives for our students, just to give them basics, because that was still something that they're not really taught in art school in general, I think. But definitely Art Center, there wasn't a huge focus on preservation or thinking about the future of like,
Mhm.
how are you going to manage your collections and things that you're doing, and what materials should you use if you really want to
Yeah.
make sure your work lasts and things like that. So just even like, it would be so great to be able to offer workshops to artists even outside, anyway.
You may regret
Okay,
saying
we're
that.
starting it. Let's go.
Yeah,
That
would
is,
love that.
I think it's a great idea to partner with art schools. And even beyond that, yeah, in younger grades, as part of art appreciation, about the story of art, and integrating that as well. But of course, some of what we're talking about is people's association with the word institute. I was just thinking, my first visual impression of an archive was when I was a kid watching the film Citizen Kane. And there's, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but a reporter visits the archive of a great man, and the idea of the great man, and the archive was a mausoleum, and the papers are taken out of what looks like a columbarian vault, and almost, and there are lots of rules. And so I think, I think that's a lot of people's impression of an archive. And I think that that's changing, partly because of your work, and also because of what's going on in museums and how some of that mystique has been penetrated as well. We have a related question from Sharon about the critical courses that helped you prepare as an archivist and as a librarian.
Rayna, do you want to go first? I'm collecting my thoughts.
I'm like, so I definitely had some really helpful courses in grad school in management of archives and special collections, but I think so much in special collections and in archives is the stuff that you learn on the job or you learn in internships. So and internships, that's a whole other discussion, but I did have an internship every semester when I was in grad school. And I feel like I learned a lot just doing that, being in a different institution, learning, like doing different things, seeing how things worked, and working with different systems sometimes, and just getting to soak it all in, and developing those skills. Because the thing is, you learn the right way to do something in class, but more often than not, the way that you learn something, like the theory behind it, is not necessarily how it's going to be practiced in real life. So I think I've become the archivist that I am through my various experiences, and that so much of it is just learning with experience and learning from my peers also, having this dialogue with Simone, and with other people I've been fortunate to meet, and learning from them and reading other things that people post, has been the best thing.
I second what Rayna said, and I would also add that I think my own experiences in library and archive spaces are also really informative in how I approach my work. Even my experiences in librarian spaces, in library conferences, or often being perceived as much younger than I am, and also usually being perceived as not a librarian professional or an archivist, being perceived as probably like an assistant, which is not to undermine the power of assistants. It's just that people have a lot of assumptions about what different things look like. So it's like, I can imagine what it's like to be a researcher and step into a space and think, and be met with someone looking at me and saying, what's she trying to do here? Like, what kind of research could she be doing? Or, these kinds of weird assumptions that people have based on our appearances, or, for, I think a lot of it is intersectional issues too. Like being a Black woman, or being an ethnically ambiguous, to some people, woman. And I don't know. I think that all those things have really impacted the way that I provide library service and public service to people in different spaces. And I always want them to feel welcome. And I'm cognizant of the fact that a lot of these histories have been erased, and I might have to go an extra step to kind of promote things that people don't even think that we might have, because they may assume that it's just a racist institution without anything on blah, blah, blah. So
well, there's actually a related question from, I hope I'm saying this right, Han. Thank you for this super great conversation. What are your thoughts on this important work on African-American and Latinx work being identified as an initiative? Will it ever become a default norm?
Do you want to go first, Rayna, or do you want me to go?
I mean, I can go first, in that I have mixed feelings about it. I think that that's a good question, in that like why does it always have to be separate? But if we're looking at it, and the fact is, like, there's less, and if somebody's going to give us money to do the thing, to start the project, then let's take the money. We also, at least at the Archives of American Art, received, the year after I started, I believe, an endowment from the Liechtenstein Foundation to, it's primarily for providing access to collections from underrepresented groups. So it's a lot more broad in what we're like, who's included. And I think that was intentional, but it is, because it's an endowment, it's ongoing. So, you know, the initiative ends, but that work continues. And so it's providing for all of that to continue and saying like, yes, this is something we're committed to doing and we're going to keep doing it. So I think sometimes it's important for those initiatives to happen to sort of like kickstart it, and hopefully that shows that like, no, this is important, we do need to keep doing it. Like it's almost like a proof of concept. But I acknowledge that like it kind of raises eyebrows a little bit in the beginning, and you know, it, especially when like there are so many initiatives happening and not all of them do continue into long-term projects or long-term sustained commitment to the work.
It's kind of like the conundrum with ethnic studies departments in universities. Yes, this is all American history, but special attention needs to be paid, at least for now. And
yeah, and sometimes, at least in the case of our initiative, it's helpful to also think about money being set aside to make sure that there's a commitment to doing this work. So it's very similar to what Rayna was saying. It's like, it helps kickstart something and make sure that there's devoted staff to spend time on it. But my understanding is that it starts with an initiative and then hopefully the work carries on and it just becomes a way that we do things. That's kind of, I think there have been initiatives in the past at the Getty that were like that with like Latinx art and stuff. So there was something else I was gonna say about that. Oh, I think that the one thing where it could be problematic is that I think if you're starting an initiative, it's good if everybody's on the same page staff-wise. If everybody is either full-time, permanent, or you know, there's some commitment to the future of the work continuing, because I think it could be really problematic if it's project-based staff that are being hired for an initiative, then it really doesn't convey that there's a long-term commitment. So that's my biggest thing. And I mean, we're grateful for places like the Studio Museum or the Schomburg, where it's like, that's what they do all day, every day. They get to do this kind of work. But I think it's important to broaden the work to other institutions so that the ability is shared, and it's not, no one institution can archive everything about Black art. Like, that's just not feasible, and every institution has backlogs. So we need a lot of people doing this work.
Right. We have a very short time. I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions. Rayna and Simone, how do you deal with terms American Indian versus Native American versus Indigenous people? And also from Laura, here's another rather loaded puzzle: how to deal with white supremacy, white privilege, white advantage. I know it's thorny, but the question arises, says Laura.
Is that with the terms?
Which terms? Or are you dealing with those terms?
I don't feel really comfortable speaking to that because I'm not dealing with those terms. But in general, when I'm discussing things, I don't shy away from using white supremacy, because I think it's an accurate term to describe systems of white privilege, and particularly the history of the United States is rooted in white supremacy, and it has its you know, echoes today that we can clearly see. So,
and have you puzzled out American Indian versus Native American versus Indigenous people?
I feel like similar. I could be wrong. I don't want to speak hand about this because I also don't feel like I'm an expert on this
Mhm.
area, but I feel like it could be a situation like Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, where it's like maybe different people like different words depending on which specific communities they're from or geographically where they're from. That's just my perspective.
Mhm.
So I don't think I'm an expert on that.
Mhm. There's at least one more question about being able as archivists to go beyond academia and even primary school and connecting with grassroots organizations. Do you know of any activities like that that just reach out beyond the borders of academia?
In our institutions or in general? Because
I get the community grassroots organizations is what's mentioned.
I don't believe that there's any coordination with the Archives of American Art and sort of grassroots community organizing. Not that I know of, that doesn't mean it's not happening, but I am not privy to it. That being said, that within the archival community, there's definitely a lot of crossover, and there's community organizing and community archives, and that's produced a lot of really great projects. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from those projects about how you do outreach that larger institutions could learn from.
That's my impression too about what's going on with community archiving. It's getting increasingly active and interesting, and there is a lot to be learned up. I wonder if the bridge couldn't be made through some kind of programming, if not institutional partnerships. Simone?
Yeah, I was trying to, as Rayna was answering, find this event that I saw that I think that some people from Black Women Radicals, here we go, sorry. There's a grassroots archivist collective of Black women that was holding a virtual meetup, or that is holding a virtual meetup Sunday, April 11th. And I believe it's made of both professionals and other memory workers that are not professionally trained. If you go to the Black Women Radicals Instagram account, there's an event about that. It says it's a grassroots archivist collective of Black women. It's transnational virtual communion of Black women and gender expansive grassroots archivists and or aspiring archivists. But I agree that like if we could have more partnerships so that we can learn from each other's expertise, because everyone brings something different to the table. And it'd be great to collaborate more in those ways.
Well,
there's about everything going on. Everyone should just like,
it's amazing.
Seriously, follow her on Instagram. She's always posting
Simone
all
knows.
of the events. I learn about everything from her.
We are almost out of time, but before we do go out of time, I want to say we're going to save stuff in the chat, and part of this process for me will be sort of compiling information, and so if you think of anything, anybody out there, please let me know. Simone and Rayna, thank you so much for this. You're getting lots of thanks and applause in the chat. So I want to thank you so much for really so generously sharing your perspectives and your thinking and for the work that you do. I'm really excited by it. And when I think of what you're turning up and what you're making available, that is can go in so many different directions and is so generative. So thank you. And we'll keep talking on the side. Rayna and I have a book we're both reading that we've been talking about. Voyage of the Sable Venus by Robin Cost Lewis, a superb book about, well, part of it is about the archive, and it's a work of beautiful poetry. So go ahead.
I was going to say, I just want to recommend Sadia Hartman's book. If anybody's looking for something else to read, that's another great book about reading archives against the grain.
Great. We're going to start a Google form, and
Yeah, we should.
we are just about out of time. So I want to thank everyone for coming this afternoon, for all of your ideas and input. And I hope to see you again on the 23rd when we talk about digital archiving and digital curation. And thank you. Does anybody from Pew want to say goodbye? Or shall I say the goodbye?
Well, I will officially say goodbye, and thanks to all of you. This was an extraordinary conversation, and I was just blown away by all of the questions and the level of engagement of everybody who was here today. So thank you very much.